Hello and welcome to the Tabletop Games blog Digital Eyes episode. Here's another game I only ever played digitally, which is why it's in the Digital Eyes category of reviews on this blog. The advantage of a digital game is that you can either play it with another person, or you can play against the AI, which can be set to a number of difficulty levels as well, so that you can ease yourself into the game. The other advantage of the digital version is that you can learn the game that way without having to read the rulebook, which is always nice. I prefer learning by doing, so this works for me really well. Patchwork is a tile-laying game using polynomial shapes. The idea is to complete your 9x9 quilt using the patches. The fewer gaps your quilt has at the end, the less points you lose at the end. You gain points per collecting buttons. Different patches have a different number of buttons on them. Some have even none. So far, it's a standard Tetris-inspired game. However, there's much more to Patchwork, of course. What makes the game stand out and what creates the excitement and strategy element is the turn order mechanism. When it's your turn, you can choose one of the next 3 patches in the offer row, which is arranged in a circle, and which means that from the start of the game you can see all available patches and in which order they will become available. Different patches not only have a different number of buttons on them, but they also cost different amounts of time to add to your patch, which makes thematic sense, but it's the time element that decides who goes next. There's a separate time track, and as you buy patches, you will move along it a certain number of steps. It continues to be your turn as long as you last on the time track. So your decision as to which patch to buy will depend on the time that patch takes to add, as well as the number of buttons on the patch. Ideally, you want to buy smaller patches that take less time, so that you can continue to buy more patches, allowing you to fill your quilt more quickly than your opponent. However, sometimes the perfect patch that fills the really awkward gap on your quilt is what you go for, even if it means that you only get one go before it's the other player's turn. The time track also decides when you get more buttons to add to your coffers. Buttons are the currency and the victory points in Patchwork, but only the buttons you actually have in your hand. The buttons on the patches in your quilt only indicate how many buttons you get paid out when you hit the relevant fields in the time track. So you do want to get as many buttons as possible into your quilt before hitting the first payout point, but you also don't want to forge too far ahead. The game is a good mix of quietly making your quilt, while also planning ahead when to spend your buttons and when to save them, and deciding when to buy a large patch that puts you a long way ahead of the other player, and when to just buy lots of smaller patches to keep the other player waiting while you happily fill your quilt neatly. Speaking of neatly, if you're the sort of person who likes quilts without gaps, then Patchwork might drive you a little bit mad, because you will always leave gaps somewhere. However, for everyone else, Patchwork is a wonderfully calm game with just enough excitement and just enough forward thinking required to allow you and another person to have a lovely time. Thank you for listening to this Tabletop Games blog Digital Eyes podcast. Please check the description below for links mentioned in this episode, as well as to the written version of this article on the blog. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give us some stars or leave a review. Please also tell your friends about me, and if you want to offer financial support, check out my Patreon and Ko-fi pages, links to which you'll find in the blog at tabletopgamesblog.com. So thank you again for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. This podcast was made possible by the generous help of my Patreon supporters: Royal Patron Sean Newman, Castle Guard David Miller, Dice Masters Alex Bardi, Paul Grogan, Robin Kay, and James Naylor, and Shining Lights Sarah Reed, Tim Vernick, and We're Not Wizards.